Making games is a complicated process, to say the very least, and it gets progressively more complicated as technology advances, as the industry and its audience grows, and as developers and publishers get more ambitious with their projects. Even the simplest of games have so much going on behind the scenes, so many systems and mechanics in place and working in conjunction to deliver what you see on the screen and you get on your controller. Often, developers are quite creative in how they choose to solve problems or accomplish specific things with the things they do behind the scenes, and here we're going to talk about a few such things. PT and Lisa. It's ridiculous that a short demo of a game that never got made as much of an impact on the industry as large as Hideo Kojima's PT did. But there's just so much going on here, okay? It's a masterclass in scaring the crap out of players at every turn, and it does that in incredibly simple yet effective ways. For instance, you're constantly hearing terrifying noises and seeing shadows that make it look and sound like something is right behind you. But of course, when you turn around, there's nothing there. Well, as it turns out, the developers made it so that Lisa will always be behind the player constantly. So when you're hearing and seeing things, that's because she's right there at your back. And when you turn around to see if she's there, well, she's still behind you.
His 6-year-old daughter has the good sense to hide in the bathroom, but reports suggest he lured her out by telling her
Alien Isolation's Xenomorph. Moving on from one horror icon to the next, just as much of a constantly terrifying presence, in a very different way of course, is the Xenomorph in Alien Isolation. There's no shortage of players who found the constant presence and terrifying threat of the stalker enemy to be too much for their heart to take. The game goes out of its way to make you feel like you're coming up against a truly insurmountable foe. In fact, the alien's got several tricks up its sleeve that give it an advantage over you that you might not even be aware of while you're playing the game. For instance, have you ever tried sneaking around by constantly hanging back behind the Xenomorph's back as it moves forward, only to find it suddenly become aware of your presence and turn around? That's because the folks at Creative Assembly literally put eyes on the back of its head. So if you get too close to it, that's game over for you. Mr. X in Resident Evil 2. Speaking of iconic stalker horror enemies, there aren't many out there that made as big of a splash among audiences as the tyrant Mr. X did in 2019's Resident Evil 2 remake. His constant booming footsteps and his relentless stalking of the RPD building as he attempts to hunt you down is a huge part of the Resident Evil 2 experience, and as you'd expect from a stalker enemy in this effective, Mr. X works in pretty interesting ways behind the scenes. For instance, when he's off camera and looking for you throughout the building, he doesn't just teleport around, he actually moves through the space from room to room, only he's incredibly sped up while he's doing it. Otherwise, he might spend too much time looking through the entire RPD building and you would barely even run into him. As soon as Mr. X approaches the player's position though, he switched back to normal speed and regular behavior. Firefights in Uncharted.
I've got you. Give me your hand.
Just go! Don't stop!
All shooters use several tricks to ensure that combat doesn't end up being too realistic and strikes just the right balance between being challenging and ensuring the players are actually having fun. Uncharted, for instance, wants to make sure that you're never feeling too overwhelmed or too much on the back foot, and employs some unique tricks to that effect. Every time you pop out of cover to aim at enemies, for instance, the game makes sure that all enemies shooting at you drop down to 0% accuracy for a couple of seconds, allowing you enough time to take aim at an enemy and fire off some shots yourself. Multiplayer in Gears of War. For someone who doesn't have a lot of experience playing competitive multiplayer games, getting into that arena can be a bit of a daunting prospect, though, of course, developers always want to draw in more players and expand their audiences. With the first Gears of War, Epic Games tried the same with some neat tricks. Anyone who played their first ever multiplayer match in the game would get a slight invisible buff for the duration of that match. Buoyed by performing well in their first multiplayer match, the player would obviously be more tempted to keep going. Streaming in open world games. Open world games are a tricky business and get trickier and trickier as they get bigger, denser, and more complicated. Obviously, though, given the limitations of most hardware and just how massive and detailed open worlds tend to be nowadays, you won't really come across games that have their entire world loaded down to the minutes of details at all times. As players move through the world, the game pulls data and assets from the system's memory to stream in more of that world around the player. This can also play into how the player moves at times in some interesting ways. In Marvel's Spider-Man, for instance, the speed at which Spidey could zip through the city had to be slowed down to ensure that the PS4 could keep up with streaming in the world as players moved through it. Loading in Metal Gear Solid 5.
All we know is that Skullface's plans are on the verge of fruition. We need to stop him while we still can.
Speaking of open world games having to employ unique tricks, Metal Gear Solid 5 too had to pull off some tricks behind the scenes. In fact, seeing as it was a cross-gen game that also had to deal with the significantly weaker hardware of the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, it had to do more than most other games of its kind at the time. For example, while you could decide to head to any enemy base you wanted in the game's open world, not all of them were loaded up and ready to go. The game only ever loaded in one enemy base at a time. Boosting players on low health. Games are always tinkering with things behind the scenes to shift things into the player's favor ever so slightly, because what's most important, after all, is that the players are having fun. One way a lot of games choose to do that is by sneakily giving you more health, at times, than you think you actually have. Oftentimes, when you've barely got a fraction of your health left, certain games will give you a health boost to give you a teensy edge to help you out of a tight situation. Of course, when you do get out of that tight situation, unaware of the game's invisible helping hand, you'll feel that much better and more exhilarated about having made it out of this situation. Left 4 Dead's AI director. Well, this is one that most people are quite aware of. It was one of Left 4 Dead's and its sequels' most heavily marketed and talked about features, after all. But it's still worth talking about because it's an entirely invisible web of systems that works almost perfectly. It constantly analyzes how players are doing and, based on a number of factors, keep making adjustments to the game's difficulty in a number of ways, tweaking everything from ammo drops to the size of enemy hordes and much more. Left 4 Dead's nail-biting tension and challenge are some of its biggest hallmarks, and the AI director is hugely responsible for that. Ammo in Half-Life 2. Half-Life is not technically a horror series, but every single one of these games has major horror vibes. Often, these manifest in gameplay as well. Half-Life 2, for instance, has more than a few horror-driven parts where you find yourself running low on ammo. The game, in fact, ensures that those moments happen every now and then by always ensuring that you're getting very tight ammo drops. More often than not, just a little smaller than you think you need to get over the next hurdle. And that brings us to the end of this video. A quick request before we conclude: we upload new videos every single day, and if you like what we're doing, please consider subscribing. It really helps us out. Also, don't forget to enable all your notifications by clicking the bell icon so that you can receive daily video updates. Thanks for watching.